It's Tom Oar.
Tom Oar spent most of his adult life in the remote mountains of Montana, in the Yaak River Valley, a place so isolated and harsh that it tested every skill, strength, and endurance a person could have. The winters there were brutal, often reaching temperatures of -50 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, with snow piling so high that even travel by snowmobile became treacherous. For decades, Tom lived off the land, relying on his ability to hunt, fish, cut firewood, craft tools, tan hides, and perform all the tasks necessary to survive in a world without convenience. On television, especially in the show Mountain Men, he appeared almost superhuman. Fans watched him survive grizzlies, climb mountains, build shelters, and thrive in isolation with a calm that seemed unshakable. He became a legend, a man who could endure what most people could not, embodying toughness, skill, and a connection to the land that was inspiring to millions. Yet what the cameras captured was only a fraction of the story. Life off-grid was far more difficult, far more punishing, and far more complex than the romanticized version shown on screen. Every day involved careful planning and immense effort, and even small mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. Cutting firewood for the cabin stoves was not a simple chore. It required hours of exertion in freezing temperatures. Checking trap lines involved traveling miles over icy terrain, often alone, and in conditions where a fall or accident could be deadly. Tasks that might take an hour for a younger man could consume an entire day for Tom as he aged. His body, built by decades of rugged living, was starting to show the natural wear and tear of time. Arthritis in his hands made detailed work difficult. Recovery from physical exertion became slower, and injuries lingered far longer than they once would have. Yet on camera, he always appeared strong and capable. Tom had learned over the years to maintain the image of the invincible mountain man. He never complained, never showed pain, and performed each task with a calm determination that concealed the physical challenges he faced. Behind the scenes, his wife Nancy observed the reality he could not or would not show. She noticed the grimaces he tried to hide, the slower movements, and the way he took longer to complete even routine tasks. She saw the exhaustion settle over him each evening and recognized the subtle signs that his body was beginning to struggle in ways television could never capture. The romanticized wilderness living that viewers admired was in truth grueling and dangerous. The mountains, which appeared beautiful and liberating on screen, demanded constant vigilance. A single medical emergency could mean death, as the nearest help was hours or even days away. Every day involved calculations of survival, from planning trap lines to preparing for sudden weather changes, and from checking for dangerous animals to ensuring that basic needs like food and firewood were met. Over time, the combination of physical strain, emotional fatigue, and isolation began to accumulate. While the public saw skill, bravery, and endurance, the private reality included pain, vulnerability, and the awareness that mistakes could no longer be taken lightly. Even Tom, who had spent decades surviving extreme conditions, began to realize that age and the limitations of the human body were challenges he could not fully overcome. Yet he persisted. His identity had been built around independence, self-reliance, and toughness. Admitting limits to himself or anyone else seemed impossible. The mountains were not just a home. They were the environment that defined who he was, the arena in which he had proven his strength. Walking away from them felt like betrayal, not only to the lifestyle he loved, but also to the persona he had carefully cultivated for television. The pressure to maintain the image of the invincible mountain man increased with each season of Mountain Men. Production schedules demanded that he perform tasks on camera, demonstrate skills, and engage in survival activities regardless of his physical condition. Injuries, exhaustion, or bad weather could not excuse him from performing for the cameras. The performance of strength became almost a trap, as Tom could not simply live his authentic life in isolation. He had to meet the expectations of an audience and production team. For years, he managed this balance, pushing through pain, fatigue, and the risks of aging. Yet each season left its mark. His hands became stiffer, his muscles slower, and recovery from even minor exertion took longer. What had once been instinctual and effortless now required conscious effort and deliberate care. Nancy watched this decline with concern, knowing that the mountains were taking a toll on the man she had spent decades with, someone whose skills and resilience were extraordinary, yet not limitless. Isolation, which had once felt like freedom, began to feel heavier, almost like imprisonment. The psychological weight of living in such extreme solitude, combined with the physical strain, created a situation where even the most legendary survivalist had limits. Tom's life required daily vigilance against threats both big and small, from weather, wildlife, or simply the effects of cold, fatigue, and overexertion. The mountains demanded constant planning, skill, and alertness, leaving little room for rest or recovery. Over time, the isolation and physical challenge created not only fatigue, but also a growing awareness of vulnerability that Tom could not ignore forever. While the cameras focused on skill, toughness, and adventure, the hidden reality involved careful calculation, pain management, and the emotional burden of knowing that each day carried serious risk. The romanticized wilderness life that audiences admired was, in reality, punishing and unrelenting. Survival was not about bravery alone. It required careful judgment, planning, and constant adaptation, especially as age and physical limitations began to accumulate. For decades, Tom had met these challenges with skill and courage, but the slow accumulation of fatigue, injury, and risk began to create a threshold beyond which continued survival in the mountains became increasingly dangerous. Every year, the physical effort required to chop firewood, check trap lines, or craft tools left longer-lasting soreness and joint pain. Every winter, the extreme isolation heightened the risk of accidents or illness, creating anxiety for Nancy and their family. What had once been a thrilling, adventurous life was increasingly a demanding, exhausting routine that required extraordinary resilience. The romanticized version of mountain living, portrayed on television, did not show the hours spent recovering from exertion, the fear of medical emergencies, or the constant mental calculations required to survive. Each season added to the cumulative strain, and Tom could see that even the strongest mountain man could not endure forever without serious risk. For Tom, the mountains had shaped his identity, his skills, and his reputation. Yet as he aged, the harsh reality of survival and the risk to his life and loved ones became impossible to ignore. The balance between authentic living and performing for television created additional pressures, as the audience's admiration depended on a portrayal of near-perfect endurance and toughness. The life he had built in Montana was extraordinary, inspiring millions, but it was not without hidden costs. Every day, Nancy observed the strain that television could not capture. The aches, the stiffness, the fatigue, and the subtle signs of declining physical capacity. She also saw the psychological weight of isolation, the quiet moments of reflection where Tom faced the limits of his enduring and realized that the mountains were becoming more dangerous as time passed. While audiences celebrated his bravery, Tom and Nancy knew that the reality of mountain living included hidden risks, long-term strain, and the challenge of sustaining a demanding lifestyle in extreme conditions. Even the skills that had kept him alive for decades, tracking, hunting, building, and crafting, were no longer sufficient to fully mitigate the danger posed by age, weather, and isolation. The romanticized image of independence and toughness began to clash with the practical realities of aging, and the recognition that life in the mountains, as extraordinary as it was, had limits. Tom's identity was inseparable from his skills and accomplishments. Yet the growing awareness of vulnerability and the need to protect himself and Nancy created a tension that would eventually lead to a profound decision. For years, he resisted the idea of leaving the mountains, seeing it as a personal failure, a surrender of the life he had mastered, and a deviation from the independence that defined him. The hidden struggle, invisible to millions of fans, had been building for decades. It combined physical strain, emotional fatigue, and the awareness of mortality, creating a situation in which continuing to live in isolation became increasingly dangerous. The mountains that had brought him fame and defined his identity also presented risks that even his legendary toughness could not overcome. It was this hidden struggle, the combination of physical limits, family concern, and the emotional burden of isolation, that set the stage for the decision that would change his life forever. The turning point for Tom Oar came during the brutal winter of 2018, a season that pushed even the most experienced wilderness experts to their limits. Snow piled high for months, temperatures plummeted far below zero, and the harsh, icy terrain made even basic survival tasks more dangerous than usual. Tom, who had spent decades moving confidently across the landscape, suddenly found himself facing situations that reminded him of his own mortality. During one routine check of his trap lines, he fell through thin ice on a creek he had crossed hundreds of times. The water wasn't deep, but at temperatures well below freezing, exposure even for a few minutes could be fatal. For the first time, Tom felt a fear that was not the normal respect for danger that kept him alive in the past, but a deep, unsettling awareness that his body was no longer as capable as it once was. His reflexes were slower, his recovery time longer, and his margin for error far narrower than decades ago. That moment cut through the armor of confidence he had built over a lifetime of surviving the wilderness. He returned to the cabin shaken, spending days in quiet reflection, grappling with the reality that continuing life in the mountains carried risks he could no longer fully control. It wasn't just the physical danger that weighed on him. It was the recognition that his stubbornness, independence, and desire to maintain the image of the unbreakable mountain man could have devastating consequences, not only for him, but also for Nancy. Nancy had watched the signs for years, noting his growing stiffness, subtle grimaces, slower movements, and increasing fatigue. She had long hinted at alternatives: a gentler lifestyle, warmer climate, access to medical care, and a pace that allowed rest and recovery. Tom resisted these suggestions, believing that leaving the mountains would be a failure, an admission that his independence and toughness had limits. But after the ice incident, it was impossible to ignore the reality. Conversations with their children, who had long expressed concern for their parents' safety, reinforced this awareness. Their children worried about emergencies, accidents, and the consequences of extreme isolation for aging parents. They had seen other mountain families face tragedy when stubbornness and pride prevented older wilderness dwellers from seeking easier living conditions. Tom realized that his determination to stay in Montana, while admirable in its independence, had created distance between him and the people he loved. His grandchildren, growing up far from the mountains, barely knew him, and the isolation of Yaak Valley made casual visits nearly impossible. This realization weighed heavily on him, as he understood that life in the mountains, once fulfilling, was limiting his ability to connect with his family in ways that mattered deeply. Nancy's perspective was also critical. She had quietly managed her own health, minimizing issues to avoid pressuring Tom. But the remoteness of their home meant that even minor problems could become emergencies. She feared the risk of accidents or illness that could happen without immediate help. She also understood the larger emotional impact: the isolation, the physical strain on Tom, and the cumulative stress of living in extreme conditions. Nancy had seen other wives of mountain men who had lost their partners because pride or stubbornness prevented recognition of limits. These women had endured tragedy silently, losing husbands who refused to adapt until it was too late. Nancy did not want to face that reality. She had spent decades supporting Tom, building a life with him from scratch in the mountains, and she now sought a life that preserved both their well-being. Her gentle yet firm encouragement became a critical factor in Tom's decision-making. It was not an ultimatum in anger, but a plea for a sustainable, safer, and more connected life. Tom had to confront a profound internal conflict. Staying in the mountains meant preserving identity, legend, and independence. Yet leaving meant prioritizing life, health, relationships, and the future. That internal struggle took months of reflection. He had to reconcile the life he had lived, the fame and admiration he had earned, and the reality of aging and vulnerability. Leaving the mountains was not simply a physical relocation, it was a profound emotional shift. The decision required him to redefine what courage meant. Courage had always been about facing extreme conditions, enduring pain, and surviving threats in the wilderness. Now, courage meant acknowledging limits, embracing vulnerability, and choosing life over legend. After long consideration, Tom and Nancy decided to leave Montana. The move to Florida offered warmth, medical access, family connections, and a less physically demanding life. It was carefully planned. They arranged for trusted people to manage their Montana property, packed essential belongings, and relocated quietly, without fanfare or public announcement. For a man whose identity had been inseparable from mountains, survival, and legend, the transition to sea level, warmth, and population density was jarring. The flat, humid, and populated environment was unfamiliar, overwhelming, and at times disorienting. Yet it also offered freedoms he had never experienced in decades. The ability to make spontaneous decisions, to move without extreme planning, and to enjoy a lifestyle that did not demand constant survival awareness. Simple daily activities, walking outside, shopping, visiting neighbors, became opportunities to enjoy life in ways impossible in the mountains. Freed from the physical and psychological burdens of extreme isolation, Tom discovered pleasures that had been long forgotten. The heat and humidity were initially uncomfortable, yet his body, relieved of constant strain and extreme cold, adjusted gradually. The pace of life allowed him to reconnect with family. He could be present with grandchildren, teach them skills, share stories, and witness everyday moments that he had missed for years. This reconnection was unexpected and deeply meaningful. Observing Nancy thrive in this new environment was another revelation. She reconnected with friends and family, experienced social interaction without isolation, and embraced healthcare access and conveniences that enhanced well-being. Seeing her happiness reinforced the wisdom of the decision to leave. Tom began to understand the full cost of his mountain stubbornness, not just physical strain and risk, but also the emotional and relational consequences of extreme isolation. Family relationships deepened, and the daily pressures of survival were replaced with manageable challenges that fostered connection rather than risk. Over time, Tom embraced this new life, realizing that leaving the mountains was not a failure, but a courageous, wise, and deliberate choice. He could preserve his skills, continue leatherwork, and maintain independence in a sustainable way, while also protecting health, relationships, and well-being. The mountains had taught him discipline, resilience, and self-reliance, but the transition taught him wisdom, humility, and perspective. This period of adjustment was not without struggle. The dramatic change in environment required physical adaptation and psychological acceptance. The density of the population, the heat, and the flat terrain were initially unsettling for someone accustomed to wide-open, rugged wilderness. Yet, over time, the sense of freedom, ease, and safety became apparent. Tasks that once required hours of preparation and careful planning could now be performed spontaneously. Tom found that the simpler, less physically demanding lifestyle allowed him to focus on meaningful work, family, and personal growth. The realization that courage included stepping away from the mountains was profound. The public may have assumed that leaving the wilderness was a retreat, a surrender, or a concession to age. Yet for Tom, it was an act of bravery, wisdom, and prioritization. Choosing life, love, health, and connection over image, legend, and performance was a profound lesson in authentic courage.